This morning, it's so good to have you here. Wonderful to be in the house of the Lord. And I want to talk about something a little different this morning. We finished up our series on the fruit of the Spirit last week, and if you missed any of that, I encourage you to go back and listen to those. But today I want to ask you a question. Have you had an idea of what you wanted your life to be like? Kind of had an idea of, here's what I want life to be like for me. And let me ask you, how's that dream for you today? How's it going? Most of us have, we've had some idea about what we want our lives to be like. And then we grow up, and then things happen, and things don't go quite according to plan. And then we just give up on our dreams. And maybe you're here this morning and God has given you a vision of your life. But it seems like your life is everything but the vision that God gave you. Maybe you're here this morning and you've even had a calling from God for a specific thing, but it seems like life has just gone a different direction, and now you wonder if God ever spoke to you at all. Maybe God has spoken to you in your life and said, I want you to do this, or be this kind of person, or have this kind of, existence, whatever. I want you to have this kind of, career, or marriage, or whatever. And you look around like, man, it ain't quite that. You might know what I'm talking about this morning. So I wanted to tell you today that you're not alone. See, there have been a lot of people before you that felt this same way. And this morning I want to take a very brief look at the life of Joseph. I could probably preach a 7-part series on the life of Joseph, but I want to take a brief look at the life of Joseph this morning. Joseph was only 17 years old. He was 17 years old when he was given a vision from God, for his life. Joseph really didn't understand the details, but it took a lot of twists and turns before Joseph actually got to the dream that God gave him. And if you'll look with me this morning, it's Genesis chapter 37. Genesis 37 verses 5 through 8. It says, "And Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Please listen to this dream which I've had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf.' Then his brothers said to him, 'Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us?' So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words." That's Genesis chapter 37. And if you flip over to Genesis chapter 42, here's what you find. 42 verse 6. "Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground." We think of great stories in the Bible. This is kind of what we do. See, we know the end of the story. A lot of times, right? We know the end of the story. Maybe we've read that story before. Or we've heard that story before. And so we know the end of the story. And this is how we do it. If we look here, we see Joseph. He's given a dream. And 5 chapters later, we see this dream coming to pass. Right? So we start, and Joseph's given a dream, and then 30 minutes later, it's all done. Right? I mean, isn't that how we read the Bible? Do you read the Bible that way? That's the way it gets in your head. I mean, it does me. Right? I mean, I read about Jesus was born one day, and a couple of weeks later, he died on the cross, but he was 30 years old, and like, well, I don't know how this works. Right? But this is how we read the Bible. So we start and we read through it, and 30 minutes later, it's the end of the story. But here's the reality. Joseph was around 40 years old when his brothers came to see him. What started when he was 17 years old took 23 years before his actual dream was a reality. And this is really important for us. And what God has planned for your life, listen, what God has planned for your life is not an event, it's a journey. What God has planned for your life is not an event, it's a journey. God can and God does orchestrate events in our lives. He does that to guide those who are committed to Him. But one event usually isn't the completion of God's plan for your life. We spend our life looking for this one big thing when God's saying, that ain't it. This is a walk. This is a journey. You're traveling through life. I'm guiding you. I'm leading you. But there's a destination that I have for you. But we got to do some walking to get there. There's some distance to travel here. It's not just a moment in time. See, God could have created this moment in time anytime. As a matter of fact, when Joseph's 17 years old and he comes out to the field and he's talking to his brothers, God could have just created that moment right there if He wanted to, and they all bow down to Him. Okay, so what? Nobody cares. But as it turned out, Joseph saved the nation of Israel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's look again. And so we see this is our starting text this morning. And we see this 17-year-old Joseph. He's telling his brothers about this dream that God gave him. Now, we can get into issues of whether or not Joseph was being a brat when he did this. Because he might have been. I mean, he was a 17-year-old boy, right? Hey, look what God said to me. I mean, you see that, right? I mean, 17, that's another message for another day. But what I want to notice here is verse 8. And so when you look at this, it says, they hated him for his dreams and what he said about his dreams. It says they hated him for his dreams and his words. Can I tell you this morning that there's a principle here that we need to get. Not everyone is going to be supportive of your dreams. Even if God Himself is the one that gave you the dream. Not everyone is going to support you, even though God is the one that gave you that vision, even though God is the one that spoke that plan into your heart. Not everyone is going to be supportive. Sometimes you'll share what God has said to you about your life, and people around you will resent you just for saying that out loud. Other people might tell you that you can't do what God has told you to do. There's some people sitting in this room, and that's happened in your very life. That God's told you to go do this, and people around you said, no, you can't do that. What are you thinking about going and trying that? Some might say that it's not you, and it's not true that you've heard from God at all. That's you just pipe dreaming all by yourself. See, some of you sitting here this morning, you've taken someone else's opinion of what God has said to you about your life. And you've abandoned what God said. Some of you, you've been called by God to a particular ministry, and people close to you have talked you out of it. Others, you've had a vision for your life that God birthed in you. But other people have told you that you really just have pipe dreams, and that's not real, and that's just you, that's not God. I want to tell you this morning that other people's opinion of what God has for your life is not what matters. If God has given you a vision for your life, if He has called you to a particular role in ministry or a career or even relationships, don't let people around you steal what God has planted in your spirit. Amen. Because some will try. If you go on down in chapter 37, here's what you find. It says it came about when Joseph reached his brothers. This was the third time that he came to them. I don't know what period of time passed, but this is about the third time that Joseph had came around. It says when he reached his brothers, they stripped him of his tunic or his coat, the coat of many colors that his father made from him. They took him and they threw him into a pit. It says the pit was empty without any water in it. So they weren't trying to drown him. But they threw him in a pit. We read this and it's kind of hard to believe that these were Joseph's brothers. I mean, it seems like something that a group of thugs might do. But understand this, again, they were responding to Joseph's dream. They didn't like what God said about Joseph's life. They didn't like what God had put into Joseph's heart. They didn't like the vision that God spoke to this young man. That's what they were responding to. Can I tell you that some people might not only just try to talk you out of it, some people might react really harshly to what God said to you. In Joseph's case, he told them what he dreamed, and they didn't like it. But they asked a couple of questions. Said, "Well, so what? You're going to reign over us, or you're going to rule over us?" They didn't know how all of that was going to work. I don't think Joseph knew how that was going to work. I think maybe they were sitting around thinking, "You know what? What? Yeah, Dad. Everybody knows Dad likes him better, right?" Everybody knows Dad likes him better. I bet he saw Dad's will, and I bet Dad put him at the top of the list. Y'all see how this is going? I mean, this is probably what they're thinking. They don't know anything about Egypt and Midianite traders. They don't know any of that stuff. They're just sitting around thinking about themselves. And they reacted harshly. They put him in a pit, and they planned on leaving him for dead. Can I tell you something? That you might find yourself in a pit even if God gave you a dream. Even if God planted a vision for your life in your spirit, you might find yourself in a pit. There are lots of ways to get in a pit. And sometimes people throw us into pits. Maybe you were abused by somebody and it felt like a pit. Maybe you were cheated on and it felt like a pit. Maybe that person who was supposed to take care of you, maybe they abandoned you and it felt like a pit. There are lots of ways that people can throw us into a pit. And I tell you, sometimes we walk into pits, sometimes we just jump into them. Maybe you're here this morning and you saw the pit and you just jumped in it anyway. Maybe you chose to go down a path all on your own. Maybe you did some things in your life that was like jumping into a pit. Maybe you headed down the path that just ended up there, a path of addiction or a path of this or a path of that. Maybe you were the one doing all of those other things to other people. And you ended up in a pit yourself. You learn lots of ways to jump in a pit. But maybe you just stumbled. Maybe you just stumbled into a pit. We go along sometimes and we think everything's good and we're just cruising down the highway and we're going in one direction, and then all of a sudden there's a pit out of nowhere. Maybe you made some mistakes and you fell into a pit. That's not what you wanted. wanted to do. You were trying to do this other thing, but all of a sudden, here you are. You're looking up at the sky from a hole. There are lots of ways to stumble into a pit. We can get thrown into a pit. We can jump into a pit. We can stumble into a pit. But understand something this morning, that God's grace is more powerful. God's grace is bigger than any pit you will ever be in. God knows where you are. It doesn't matter how you got there. God is looking at you this very morning and telling you that His grace is more powerful than your pit. Psalm 139:7, David said this. He said, where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you're there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. He said these words to God, and he was talking about God when he said, look, no matter where I am, you're there with me. Even if I'm in places that are unreachable by human beings, your hand will lead me. Even if I'm in that place that others can't even think about, your hand will lay hold of me. I'm here to tell you today that you will never find yourself in a place that God doesn't already know about. You will never find yourself in a place that God can't reach you. It doesn't matter if your family understands where you are. It doesn't matter if your friends, your spouse, your kids, your boss, or anyone else gets it. God knows where you are, and you will never be in a place where He can't reach you. I don't know what Joseph thought at that moment. I don't know what was going through his head when he was in this pit. I don't know what happened to his dream after he was thrown into the hole and he was left for dead. But what I can tell you is that God brought him out of it. I don't know what you're facing today. I don't know what life is like for you this morning, but I do know that God can bring you out of that pit, and He can put you on a path to fulfill His promises in your life. Give the Lord praise this morning. I know it seems like things are off track right now, but God knows how to get them back on track. See, but sometimes we get off God's map, right? God has this, God, kind of draws straight lines, He's heading up the road here, and he says, quickest way to Morgantown, straight up 79, right? It's a straight line up through there. And sometimes we just take the wrong route. You know what God does? God says, I just draw a new map. God just draws a new map. He doesn't scrap the plan. He doesn't throw you away. He doesn't let you go on up, and end up somewhere else. He just draws a new map. He said, here's the way back there. It's all right. Might take a little longer. There might be some detours. Might have to go over a couple of mountains. Might have to cut through some brush in a few places, right? But I'm just going to draw you a brand new map. God doesn't just leave us. I mean, the road isn't always pleasant. It wasn't for Joseph. I said it was going to be brief this morning, so it will be. Look at his life. See, Joseph got out of the pit. He got out of the pit. But here's what he got into. He got out of the pit and he got into slavery. I mean, what happened next in the story said he's in the pit and he's looking up. And some Midianite traders came through. And his brother said, hey, let's at least make some money. And they sold him. They sold him. They got Joseph up out of the pit. Good for them, right? Yay, you rescued your brother. No, we sold him as a slave. We got $20 for him. So it says they sold him for 20 pieces of silver. Some of y'all here, you thinking, $20 for my brother, I might take it. Joseph had a dream to be a ruler. It's a vision that God put in his heart. And now, here he is. He is a product on the slave market. I'll tell you this morning that when you're coming out of the pit, sometimes it feels like you're just going into a different pit. And that's okay. God will get you out of the pit. You know, remember, God's path isn't an event. It's a journey. Being a slave, that was another pit that Joseph was in, but it was part of Joseph's journey. See, Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and he worked as a butler for the chief of staff of the Egyptian Secret Service. It's who Joseph worked for. Says the captain of the bodyguard and all that stuff. I know what that means. And he was working for the chief of the Secret Service. This is who Joseph worked for. And Joseph was a steward, and the guy's name was Potiphar, by the way. And Potiphar's wife, she had the hots for Joseph. She did. Potiphar's wife has the hots for Joseph, and she tries to get Joseph to sleep with her, and Joseph refused. Joseph was framed for a crime that he never committed. She accused him of rape. He was a slave, so he really had no voice anyway, and so they said, fine, throw him into prison. Can I tell you that even when things are going well, sometimes doing the right thing, it costs you. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you. We're so avoidant of pain that we look at the cost of doing the right thing. We look at the pain involved in doing the right thing. Joseph said, I'm not doing that. That's a standard that God has set for me. God said don't do that. God said don't touch the unclean thing. And I am not going there. I'm going to hold to my relationship with God. This is not my notes this morning, but I want to tell you something. That no matter what pit you're in, and no matter what one you came out of, if you want to wreck God's dream and vision for your life, then walk away from it. That's a good way to do it. Walk away from His standards. Turn your back on what He said. Refuse to follow His commandments. Refuse to live a life that He set out for you. That's a good way for us to wreck God's vision for our life. But he was framed for a crime he never committed. He ended up in prison. And so here again, Joseph finds himself in another pit. Think about this. His brothers threw him in a hole. They drag him out of the hole. They sell him as a slave. He gets down to Egypt. It's like, hey, doing pretty well. Yep, might be a slave, but I'm around the palace now. All right. Slaves around here got it pretty good. And then he's in jail. Now he's in another pit. Worse off, he was in jail for something he didn't do. By the way, most people aren't in our world. Especially the state of West Virginia, I promise you. They all tell me they're not guilty. They are. But while he was there, Joseph interpreted some dreams. The Pharaoh's butler. He came, and Joseph interpreted the butler's dream. And I want to notice something about that. In Genesis chapter 40, verse 8, you can read that later. Joseph gives credit to God for the interpretation. Joseph gives credit to God for the interpretation of the dream. He'll tell you that even when things look bad, God's still God. Even when you're in a place you don't want to be, believe God can use you to show other people who He is. Look around your circumstances right now. Look around your life right now. You might be in a dark place. You might be in a place you don't want to be. But look around. Who is there that you can bless by showing them who God is? Is there a connection to someone in your life that God wants to use to show Himself to someone? Even in the worst of places. So Joseph, he interprets this dream and he gives God the credit. He tells them who Jehovah is. And he said to the butler, he said, hey, just remember me when you get back to Pharaoh here in a few days. Butler said, oh man, sure will. I'm going to put in a word for you. Butler went back upstairs. The Bible says in Genesis 40:23, it says the chief cupbearer, it was the butler, said he forgot about Joseph. Has that ever happened to you? Someone ever promised you something and then it's never followed through? As pastor, it happens all the time. I will tell you that. Happens all the time. I bet there's 20 people here this morning that told me this week is going to be here. That aren't here. Happens every week, by the way. Which is fine. Yeah. Have you ever had that moment and you thought somebody was going to help you get to that next spot? It's almost like they started helping you build some stairs and then they come by and knock them off. Knock them down while you're on it. That person who said, I'm going to do this for you, I'm going to do that for you, I'm going to make sure that all this gets taken care of. Promise you the moon and then they disappear. Anybody ever had that? Boy, I sure have. I have it sometimes when it costs me more money than I had. This person disappears and I'm left holding the bag. That now what moment that Joseph was in. It's that moment like, and then brother said he was going to do this and he didn't. And I had this dream, and I had this vision, and I had this plan, and God said this was going to happen. And here, the person that can help me accomplish it, nowhere to be found. Can I tell you something this morning? It hurts when that happens, doesn't it? Hurts when those friends that you counted on, you find out, no, you can't really count on. All those things are painful, but I want to tell you this morning that God can fulfill His plan in your life regardless of what other people do or don't do. God's work in your life is His work, not another person's work. Other people may very well fail you, but He never will. Understand this. Joseph spent 2 years in prison. He spent 2 years in prison. And God had this plan. God had this vision for him all along and planted that in his spirit. And Joseph spent 2 years in prison. And eventually Pharaoh had a dream. And nobody had any idea. And then the butler, he's like, hey, you know what? I knew this guy, he's probably mad at me. But I knew this guy a couple years ago down in jail. You know, you might give me an eye, Jimmy, when you bring him up here. But he interpreted the dream for me, and he was right. Matter of fact, he interpreted the dream for the baker. You remember the baker? One you hang. Interpret that dream for him too. He's right about that. He's no longer with us. He said, I remember that guy. And Pharaoh said, bring him up to me. And so he gave Pharaoh the interpretation of this dream. And here's the thing. As a result of that, Joseph, he's made the vice president, I suppose, of Egypt at that point in time. Pharaoh looked at him and said, only in regard to the throne are you not equal to me in power. So this guy, he goes from prison to the vice president in a day. See, every pit that you find yourself in, you don't know what God can do with that. Now, am I going to suggest to you that everything that happens in your life is God orchestrated? No. But God can take any of it and use it for your good. Here's what Genesis 41:46 says. It said, now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. 30 years old. 13 years after he was given the dream. That's the day that he actually met the Pharaoh. We like to think that these things happen, but it takes time. I don't know what your situation is this morning. I don't know what you're looking at today. You might be looking at your situation and thinking, oh, it's over now. It's over now. It's just too late for me. Maybe you think your pit's too deep. Maybe you think you've been in too many pits. Take a look at Joseph's life. He got out of the pit and he got into God's plan. This morning, I don't know what kind of dream you've had. I don't know what kind of vision you've had. I don't know what thing God has planted in your spirit. What I do know is that God can take you on a journey to fulfill His plan for your life. Let's all stand this morning.